Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 165 of the Peak of Serenity podcast. I am, as always, one of your hosts, emallson, and joining me, we have my co host, Anomoly.
Hello.
And this week, 1015 has arrived. Augmentation is here, Brewmaster changes are in, and some of those things are broken.
Yeah, a couple of them. One big one.
One big one. So today we are going to talk about our progress. I got Sark down. You're still working on it, and also talk about some of the stuff this morning. There was a very spicy augmentation stacking heroic run.
Yeah.
Did some very silly things, kind of vaguely reminiscent of the Windwalker run.
Yes. Yes.
Um, yeah. And then, we have news. We have lots of news, actually. And I also want to talk a little bit about the Brewmaster stuff, but we'll probably fit that in when I'm talking about our Sarkareth.
That makes sense.
Uh,
That makes sense. So I guess maybe I mean you have better news than I do. How is your progress going? Or how was it? I guess because
yeah,
you're done.
we got it. It took us, how long did it take us? About 2.5 hours on Friday to wrap it
Nice.
up. Really, so we did the no down strategy for Sarkareth, and the way that it felt is really that if you had cooldowns prepared for the double the spell that happens, we did it at 7:05. I can, like, if anybody wants to know exactly our stuff for that, go pop into the Raid Lead Exchange Discord and ask
Hmm.
around. Um, but yeah, if you have cooldown set up for that, it's really like once we were just living with everybody getting into phase 3, it did not take very many phase 3 pulls to actually get it down. In
Nice.
particular, it did not take very many pulls to the end of the fight. It's just not like the end of the fight is just not very complicated. Um,
Yeah.
we got it down. I actually almost wiped us at the very end because I forgot to go down with the tank bomb.
Well, man, way to go. Way to go.
We had a couple people that were high on Oblivion stacks, actually up to 8 stacks, which is very
Oh,
important because the double dispel gives you 2 stacks. They got 10, they got sent down, and that left puddles in melee too. So we lost like 5 people to that little snafu. Um,
good.
but then from there, like everything was pretty chill up until I blew up on the raid. Well, I blew up on the raid at like a 1/4% boss HP. So technically, if those people hadn't died, I never would have blown up on the raid and everything would have been fine.
It's true. Blame it on the people who died. That's fair. That's fair. That's fair.
um, yeah, also kind of in that, Brewmaster has, like, we've got our changes, we got the new talent. New talent, like, it's not unplayable. You can definitely play with it and have fun with it. It is not, from everything we've seen, not optimal. And there's a couple
Gotcha.
of reasons for that. One is that Tiger Palm is really, 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 really good right now. Blackout combo Tiger Palm, really good. I did 90k DPS on our kill.
Okay.
My number 2 damage source at almost 11% of our damage is Tiger Palm.
Interesting.
Um, there are ranks on like Magmarex that are over 100k for Brewmasters now. You can't quite do that on Sarkareth because of downtime and things, but you can
Mhm.
get over 100k, including like no glimmers and empty recollections and all that stuff. So Brewmaster does a lot of damage right now, and actually that's one thing that Brewmaster had been bringing. Like, it did really good damage, then it got nerfed. Now it's back to being like a really, really high damage tank, which kind of makes up for not bringing other things like AMZ or Rally or Darkness. You know,
Yeah. Or
uh,
roar, I guess. If you play Guardian, I don't know what does Guardian do. They make you run faster. So
yeah, yeah. War, Cyclone, ATF, all that stuff that Guardian currently brings.
that's
Also,
true.
actually, Guardian is also a high damage tank right now. I think there's 6-figure logs for them on Magmarax too.
Okay. Nice.
Um, but yeah, and this is the closest we've been to like the end of Legion rotation since the end of Legion. like the End of
Okay.
Legion Blackout combo rotation. For those that don't remember it, that was basically you had two. Your rotation broke down into two bits. You
Mhm.
had a 3 GCD combo that, pushed Keg Smash, and then a 3 GCD combo that didn't. And that's how it works now. Except instead of 3 GCDs, it's 4. So now it's like you do Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, and then Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, and dump a couple of CDs. And you just loop
Gotcha.
that. That's the rotation. That's the whole thing.
Nice.
So it feels a lot like the End of Legion Brewmaster. It does a lot of damage like the End of Legion Brewmaster. And yeah, that is something that was pretty nice. I ended up in phase 1 doing 30k DPS more, I think, than I had been
Oh,
the
okay.
previous week, which is a lot.
Yeah, that's a fair amount. That's awesome. That's
Uh,
awesome. Well, congrats on getting it down. That's sick.
uh,
You guys did really well this tier. This was like one of your best tiers, I think, right? As a
it was
group, or
actually, in terms of rankings, it was literally identical to last year.
oh, really?
Or at least in terms of US rankings, it was literally identical. In terms of world rankings, it's like 3 off or something. It's really,
Gotcha.
really close. Um, so it felt better than last year. Like last year,
Yeah,
we kind of blew through a bunch of stuff and then just stalled on Razagath. This
yeah.
tier, we weren't positioned to be able to abuse the Zskarn cheese,
That's true.
and
That's fair.
that sucked. But then on the later bosses, we did pretty well and made up for it to some degree. Um, my only like for the post Zskarn stuff, my
Hmm.
only real wish that had been different is actually for Sarkareth. We spent a lot of time in phase 2 figuring things out there that I
Yeah,
wish I had recognized sooner what the actual problem was, which it was basically that like our range baits were pretty good, but our melee baits were all over the place.
yeah.
And so that was just making things very chaotic. I didn't really put two and two together that that's why things were really chaotic. It wasn't just a chaotic phase. It's actually a very orderly phase once you get it
Mm.
all sorted out. But we weren't being super particular about our melee baits, and that was causing problems. And I wish I had recognized that sooner because it would have saved us a bunch of. And also, I died a lot
Gotcha.
in phase 2. Some of it was trying to manage the chaos, and some of it was just me being like too aggressive at throwing my cooldowns and then not having them when I needed them later.
Gotcha. Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, cool. Well, yeah, I don't have as great of news. We're still progressing. We're at about 140 pulls in, I want to say. Roughly at like the start of P3 transition is what we're working on right now. So we're getting consistent P1s, consistent P2s. And so now we're just working on that transition from P2 into P3. And we are doing the down strat. So
I
that
have
is
I have a note for
I'm sorry.
you.
Okay.
Actually, I'm assuming you're using the Viserio sheet because like everybody uses the Viserio sheet.
Yeah.
Viserio's timer for going downstairs has you as the debuff, the like absolute latest that you can come up around 1 second before you can actually come up. Or sorry, 1 second
Gotcha.
after you can actually come up. So like it does work, but there's really not very much time. You do not have a lot of wiggle room. Um, One of the things we did that ended up helping us is we moved that first timer for going down back by 3 seconds. So we went down 3 seconds later, and that did two things. One, it gave us more time to like form up after finishing
Yeah.
off the last ad, which then actually let us move extra damage into the boss during phase 2, which helped with the phase 3 push. And then also meant that when the rocks spawned at the start of phase 3, that you have to wait until those spawn before you can go up.
Mhm.
Um, we had like 3 to 4 seconds left on it instead of one, and that just made it
Gotcha.
easier for people to safely come up. And like you could still wait to the end, and some people did that to get their haste stacks and stuff. Other people came up like basically as soon as it was safe, and you get to come up at the same time. You just have less time to get all your stacks. For me, the stacks don't really matter that much, so like I got 8 or something and then went up.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think next time I think the other thing we've been doing that's a little off in that is we've been dispelling the final debuff fairly early. So I think we're
Okay,
going to end
yeah.
up holding it a little bit longer than the other ones. And yeah, that might help with getting the ads down. So you're not dealing with like getting blown back, moving into position, and then killing ads at the same time. So,
Yeah.
yep,
We
we'll
were
see.
doing the dispel around the point that the boss flew away.
Yeah, we're like 6 or 7 seconds earlier than that. So
Yeah,
like
okay.
that's I think the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, we're 150 pulls in with it. We had a new comp again on
Oh
Tuesday.
no.
Thursday was the same comp as Tuesday, but it's without
Hey.
our typical raid leader. So we had both our main tanks back. Healing core actually has been the only consistent thing, and we had we had different damage in. We had a couple different players in from a DPS perspective. So we've been playing this summer like roster game. We've been
Yeah.
able to raid every night, which is good. So we haven't missed a night. It's just been like a lot of just like different people in. I think we had 2 warlocks in this week, which is different than we've had previously.
Yeah.
An extra moonkin that we typically don't have. So it's been this has been I feel like we go through this as a guild a lot, and like this is the first year that I feel like I've been a part of it. Because typically it's me being out. Like I've missed the
Right.
past couple of not
And
this
you were out for part of Hazzikostas, right?
I was out for part of Razagath. I missed what was the final boss
Jailer.
of I missed Jailer. I missed Denathrius. I was there
Man.
for Sylvanas. But yeah, so for me it's weird. I missed the last bosses of a lot of raids, which is new thing since Shadowlands. But no, I mean we probably have in my mind like if Tuesday goes well and we start to see phase 3 more consistently, I think Thursday's the earliest we go for a kill. If not, definitely, the following week. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we're about 2 to 3 raid nights, I feel like, away from a kill. So
Yeah.
but yeah,
It's
we'll see how it
actually
goes.
so
I'm sorry.
we continued to have a little bit of internet trouble this week. Our warlock
Oh,
was
no.
our other warlock has 0 pulls on the boss because they were on vacation for most of Prague
Mhm.
on Sarkareth. And so our warlock that we had in was having internet issues, and just like a funny little thing on our kill poll, right? Old
Mhm.
timers hitting 0, and we just hear in voice, "Oh fuck, it happened again."
Oh no.
They ended up not fully DCing, so they were able to like do the pull. Their
Yeah.
ramp was like slightly scuffed. It like screwed up their cooldowns later in the fight, but you
Yeah.
know, um, we did it. So
Nice. That's all that matters.
yep,
That's all that matters. That's funny. Well, that's awesome. Congratulations on getting it down. You get to now farm it all. Go back on. You get to
yeah,
kill some bosses again. So
we get to go and do some other bosses now.
no, definitely. That's awesome. Well, cool. Well, maybe we'll move forward a little bit, get a little bit of a week in review. And so there's a bunch of different news stories. So I'll hit a couple of the quick hitter ones, and then I think there's a couple of these we can spend some time on. So first up, not really particularly game related, but definitely affects the game is the Blizzard Activision and Microsoft merger. Essentially, Microsoft announced they were purchasing Activision Blizzard about a year ago, I want to say, 9 months. And so there's been like a bunch of litigation with any sort of major move like this. And the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission here in the U.S., sued to stop the merger, and they lost thoroughly in court. So I'm not going to bore people with like the legalese of all this, but if you care, I would say like go back, read a couple of read the filing. It's like 53 pages, super interesting. But essentially, what ended up happening is the judge threw out the FTC's case. They have one more appeal out, which does not look good, primarily because a couple of things have happened this week, which basically means there's only 2 countries remaining that are blocking the merger, and that's the UK, which it looks like in the UK, Microsoft's gonna like divest a portion of Activision Blizzard, and like the UK will be happy with that. And then New Zealand started their final like tribunal reviews, I think today, and there shouldn't be an issue there if every other major country in the world sort of approved it. So
Yeah,
New Zealand and the UK, I think, are the final 2 countries remaining, but the UK seems like a moot point, and then New Zealand doesn't seem like they'll potentially hold it up. So
I still have very mixed feelings on this. Like, it is a big centralization of stuff under the Microsoft umbrella, right? And
yeah,
Microsoft did do things like force Bethesda to make their games Xbox exclusive, but also fuck Bobby Kotick.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's the idea of like the biggest thing around that for me is like Microsoft. Being in the Microsoft ecosystem, I'm a I'm a little bit of a fan just because I already have Game Pass, which is like their subscription service.
Right.
And so like I'm in the ecosystem. If they like Microsoft's thing is like any first party game they release always goes on Game Pass at this point. So that includes you like Starfield coming up from Bethesda in a couple months.
Yeah.
Whatever Blizzard's next single player game, if this goes through, generally will probably also be on that service. So I'm kind of happy, but I agree. It's sort of like the idea of like the streaming thing, like where everything sort of like media just sort of congregates into a couple of companies. So
Yeah.
but in general, from an exclusive perspective, Microsoft is not as bad as PlayStation or Sony is. So I don't feel too bad about that. So yeah, so that's on that. So it looks like merger going to go through, which means in a couple years we'll probably see something happen. But mergers like that large always take a while to sort of all filter out and see what actually happens. So don't expect much to change in terms of Blizzard stuff though. Like there's not tomorrow all of a sudden it's Microsoft and everything's great. Like I know Bethesda is still Bethesda and they've been, under the Microsoft umbrella for a couple of years now. So they'll still put out some janky ass buggy game that doesn't work and they'll then patch it. So
Or let the modders patch it instead.
it's true. Exactly. Cool. All right. Well, then next up, quick little story. Well, since we're going to eventually talk about augmentation evokers or just evokers in general, Blizzard did clarify that they have put in place bad luck protection for the evoker legendary weapon in this patch. So basically, the idea is it's not retroactive, so it only counts for future kills starting in 10.15. And the idea is that if you don't get the drop, you get a bit of bad luck protection for the next time you kill it. With depending on the difficulty you're killing it in, that bad luck protection is increased. Meaning, if you kill it on Mythic, don't get it, you get like the largest bump in bad luck protection versus heroic, etc.
Yeah.
They don't stack. It doesn't seem like so you can't like kill it like people have been doing, which is like lower difficulties up.
It's the kind of system that they've been using for a while with like currencies and things, where if you kill it on heroic, maybe you get 1% buff, and then if you kill it on Mythic, you get another 1%. But if you had just killed it on Mythic, you would have just gotten 2% instead of having to get 1 and then 1.
Yeah, exactly. So, good for you evokers out there. Good for maybe my evoker. We'll see if we eventually get an legendary weapon. So.
Just want to mention the numbers I used there were pulled out of my ass. I have no idea what the numbers are. Nobody does. I hope it's not just 1% because that's kind of low. But yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, so bad luck protection on that. I think it makes sense. To be completely honest with you, I think I like this acquisition method. It kind of sucks that it sort of dropped immediately for the first mythic kill for liquid, and everybody thought it was a guaranteed drop. But if they had been a little bit more upfront with the fact that it was a chance, fine with it. So it feels like the fact you can get it on lower difficulty sort of hurts it more in my mind. But.
Right, and they also didn't clarify for a long time that it wasn't an independent chance per difficulty. It was a like not once per week basically, but if you just killed it on the highest difficulty, you had that was your shot, right?
Yeah.
If you killed it on lower and then the higher, you just wasted your time on the lower because the higher is the chance to use, basically.
Exactly. So just a little bit of not a ton of information around it, which sucks that has eventually come out. But no, it's a weapon you get to craft. I think it's cool. Well, moving quickly here, because we have a lot to talk about. One feature that didn't really get a ton of sort of play, which I don't even know if we knew about was coming, is there is the sort of a gear catch-up system in place, which basically is any character between the levels of 10 and 60 that you don't log into for 60 days. When you log back in, they get a special like welcome back gift, which essentially does a couple things. Gives you like a full set of level appropriate gear. So in case you're behind in a gear, it sort of get a bunch of gear. Set your specialization to a specific thing. When you log in, you get to select which specialization you want to do, and the gear matches that specialization. It also lets you wipe the quest log of the character and then place you in either Orgrimmar or Stormwind near Chromie, so you can then select like the next expansion you want to level through. Yeah. It doesn't wipe quest logs if you're in BF or what was it? If you're in Shadowlands or BFA, I think they said. But if you're lower, you can always select that. So it's a good change. I mean, it's good in case like you are like leveling a character, stop leveling them, and then like want to pick it back up and you're lost. Like I've definitely done that before with older characters where I've logged in and been like, what am I supposed to be working on? Because I'm in the middle of a zone that like I don't know why I just logged off here.
Yeah, there's also things like every time they've kind of tweaked gear scaling, which they did at the beginning of Dragonflight, so this is pretty recent too. Um,
Mhm.
your old gear could end up in kind of a weird state where it wasn't really high enough item level for the zone you were now in or the level you now were. Um,
Mhm.
they fixed some of that with the gear scaling for Dragonflight that they had broken with the Dragonflight pre-patch. But there's still issues with it, especially like if you have a character that you haven't logged into since like Legion, right? If you log into them now, their gear is kind of hosed.
Yep.
And so this feature fixes that. If you've got a level 50 or something that you haven't logged into since Legion, um, that can now, yeah, you can log in, have level appropriate gear, and be good to go.
Yep. Exactly. So it's a good. I think it's a good like just hey, getting back into character, play it, and you get set up with the ability to like move yourself, not do a bunch of work to like actually go and play that character. It's
Yep.
just like hey, reset everything, jump in and play the game. So good to get people back into it, which I think is something that Blizzard should kind of keep on top of. Um, as like even I have a couple buddies that have just randomly come back just to play the game for a couple months. So well, cool. Well, I think we're gonna hit maybe next up the nerf section, or well, let's call it what it is, the changes section of the podcast. So there was a bunch of, or not a bunch of, there's probably just three key changes that came out this week to both fights and items. We'll sort of take them one at a time. So one of the first one is Mythic Zskarn got changed again. And so not majorly, but they did change
Mm-mm,
timers for
mm-mm.
two
Majorly.
abilities.
Okay. All
They
right.
changed timers for abilities.
But
They
what
changed
this
timers for
does,
abilities.
so you know those overlaps I was really, really complaining about, like tactical destruction plus trap overlaps, where you are having to run out of the tactical destruction into a safe zone for the traps. They had already
Mm-hmm.
kind of like made those better by not having random traps, but now traps don't occur during those at all. Those overlaps are gone. The other thing about it is the way that they change the timers, there are no longer conflicting things in the spell queue. Like you could end up with two abilities in the spell queue, and the order that they went off in was just kind of arbitrary. You could usually get one, but sometimes would get the other, and it would change how the fight played out, and it was very frustrating. Now that doesn't happen because the spells just don't end up conflicting. So the spell queuing issue is also gone. So I would actually call this a fairly major change, even if a lot of the impact of the overlaps was already blunted by the change to not have random traps.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe the specific changes, since we started talking about
Yeah.
this changes
Okay.
overlap.
Okay.
So, Dragonfire traps, the cooldown of the spell was changed from about 30 seconds to now 34 seconds. So there are now 4 seconds delayed after the first set. So the first cast of
The first
Dragonfire
set
traps
special. Yeah.
is still, yeah, it's still the same. I think it's like 20 seconds into the fight, but every cast after that will now be 4 seconds later. And so what that ends up doing overall, like you said, misses the overlap, and then I think based on the timings, you'll get one less trap set across the entire encounter before the enrage. So one less trap set to deal with. And the other cooldown they adjusted was the shrapnel bomb, so basically the tank soak bombs. That went from 30 seconds to 45 seconds. And so that's I think three less sets of bombs, which is I think that's probably the biggest change here. Um, Number one, the overlaps I think are huge, but then just three less sets mean you probably can get away now with even two tanking this as a part of your even progression if you're still progressing
Yeah.
in Zskarn.
There are a lot of guilds that do to tank this on Prog. I do think
Yeah.
it's easier because the damage check is not real to 2-3 tank it. And just
Yeah.
like that third tank runs around, does bombs and actually can do traps and can free up people. If you're not running around with multiple BM hunters, they can just do traps for free basically.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but yeah, it's just another change on Zskarn to get rid of the overlaps, which I mean, it almost seems like this might have been like I know we dislike random traps. Well, the community dislike. I don't think they're that bad. They are annoying, but in any event, it almost seems like this would have been the better change to start
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's
Like
a smaller change. Yeah.
yeah, change some of the overlaps with that. Change the fact that like you're not running like you said, you're not doing tidal destruction plus traps are spawning, so you potentially are running into traps and like you lose your safe area,
Right.
things like that. So yeah, I mean, it is what it is, but yeah, more changes to Zskarn, which is yeah, I mean a boss that I don't know. It's weird. It's a weird boss in that like I really liked it, but at the same time had some frustrating pieces to it. So
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't say I really liked it, but I did have fun parking it, and I would have had more fun if we didn't have random pulls just get like, spiked by these stupid traps spawning where we're trying to run to.
exactly. So arguably the best boss in this instance, I would say, is also receiving some nerfs. So Rashok, the Elder, aka the probably the highest healing check boss we have in the raid, is receiving some nerfs, primarily to 3 key abilities. So that is the Searing Slam damage has been reduced, overcharge damage has been reduced, and the Conduit Flare damage has been reduced. So essentially all of the major healing events, or sorry, well, damage events that require healing, their damage has been reduced, between 6.5% and 12%, which should lessen the healing check for this fight, um, which is good. I mean, I think this was, to be fair, the hardest in this raid, at least the hardest healing check boss, and I would say honestly, the hardest healing check boss we've had in a while. There's been, at least from a start to finish type boss, there's been bosses before where there have been sections of the boss very difficult to heal, very high healing, but like in general, something like this or this boss was like foot on the gas from the start to finish, and it was intense.
Yeah, so for reference, the Searing Slam change in particular, what this kind of targets is at the end of the fight, Searing Slam is dealing more than your entire health bar.
Mhm.
It's just more than your whole health bar. They reduce the damage of it by 6.5%. What that does, it's still going to be a little bit more than your health bar. Like you need a DR cooldown for it. It is very difficult to make a raid comp that doesn't have that. You have to have 0 warriors. You have to have no holy paladin,
Yep.
no resto shaman.
Yep.
You can't really have any. I mean, you get the like 3% DR from any paladin. No
Yeah.
death knights.
Oh, yeah. And then no
Uh,
disc.
Yeah, and your
Barrier.
priest can't play disc, which they shouldn't be playing disc. They should be playing holy. But I mean, if you had literally 0 other DRs, your priest could play disc, and that actually could be
Yep.
the play because of the DR. Like it's just really difficult though to like enter this boss and have no way to live the last one now. Um, Before you kind of needed 2 to make it safe with the
Yeah.
overcharge dot going off, and now you don't. Now you don't.
It'll be a lot safer. So yeah, and I mean that'll basically trickle down to even earlier on the fight, because that was the biggest thing, was from a cooldown perspective. You wanted everything late, but you also sometimes you needed it earlier in the fight. So
Right, and balancing those 2
yeah.
things is hard. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, particularly with the fight length and the fact that like you couldn't get 3 clean uses of most 3-minute cooldowns. It was like you basically would only get 2, which means you're huge delays in between using them.
You would
It's
have like this awkward middle of just
yeah,
dead zone
just
of
live, do whatever you can.
yeah, where it's like you're carrying with Yulon and Flourish and other
Yeah.
short cooldown stuff.
Yeah, any minute cooldown that a healer can have,
Which
or yeah, like
actually
defenses.
big like benefit to Mistweavers. Yulon being a 1-minute cooldown was great for this fight.
Yeah, no, yeah, we blasted. So, but yeah, no. So I mean, good changes. I think we're gonna start to see more of this now, um, between now and sort of 10-2 or 10 whenever 10-2 it's right. So we'll hit
Yeah.
10-1-7. I think their goal is probably 10-1-7. If you're a mythic guild that puts in any serious time, you kill. You clear Sarkareth at that point. So,
Yeah.
um, so cool. And then one final change or nerf, probably warranted, is they made an item change to a new item that came in with the new mega dungeon, Echoing Tyrstone, which is a healing trinket. Essentially, what it ends up doing is it's an on-use trinket. It allows you to store healing, and then it expends that healing to your allies. The problem is it's uncapped in the way that it distributes its healing, and it does a lot of healing, to the tune of, there's a couple of logs out there where it's, doing more than a revival, like double revival healing.
I
And I
have
think that's too.
our
Yeah.
Sarkareth kill. It did more than revival, actually multiple times.
Yeah. There's a couple other sort of like videos and logs of it just negating mechanics because it triggers when people's health drop. So I know Swaggles put out a clip of it just like on experiments, that first boss that does the AoE, his raid HP just not moving when they all stood in the AoE. And it's just, yeah, I mean, so what Blizzard ended up doing is they are nerfing it in a couple different ways. So basically, they are going to change it to now split the healing among the targets within its radius. However, it will increase. They will increase the overall amount it heals. So basically, it will now be able to record, I think, 70% more healing, but that will be split evenly across all of the allies in its radius. And so the idea is that essentially this brings its power down slightly. We'll have to see exactly what this does in terms of how much. It was, of course, the best healing trinket in the game. Probably that maybe not has ever been in the game, but it's very, very good. And so we'll see if this nerf actually pushes it down. I still will suspect this will be a very good trinket for your healers to chase, though.
Often,
Even
when they
after these go
target
lives.
these things, they try and nerf them in ways that they're still the best. They just aren't like completely busted, right?
Broken.
Right,
Yeah.
taking it down to where it's like 2% better than the next best thing, or good, but maybe more niche. Maybe sometimes it's really good and sometimes it's really not. Rather
Exactly.
than just absolutely gutting it and making it just terrible. Because like people spent time trying to get it and they don't want to make that time. They don't want to invalidate that time. Basically, they try to avoid that.
All I can tell is they've definitely over nerfed things in the past.
True.
I still remember, what was the trinket? It was from the courtyard boss at Nighthold, the mirror, I think it was,
Mm-hmm.
which was arguably best healer trinket coming out of Nighthold, and then became the worst one you could pick up after I looted it heroic week. Really,
Nice.
they nerfed it after heroic week, which is great. Love Blizzard.
Nice.
But yeah. So I mean, echoing Tyrstone, the nerf was needed. I think to be fair, like I said, this basically will bring it in line more towards probably, one of your top trinkets you can get. So right around, if you're a Mistweaver class trinket, or Nelth trinket plus Rashok in like that region, um, of a trinket. So um, all right, cool. Moving on. So that's out of the sort of the changes for this week. So sorry, next little news review thing is there was a community council interview with old Mr. Eon and Graham Berger. Dude, Graham making his rounds. Love
Yep.
Graham. Back on this. And so the community council interview asked a bunch of questions. They hit on a couple of topics. So I just want to pull out a couple of things. And maybe we hold the augmentation discussion for the end, so we can sort
Yeah.
of link that with the next piece, and we'll sort of talk about that because
Yeah.
they do a section on augmentation. Um, so a couple of things. They did talk a little bit on the gearing aspect, and so I think what Ian's point was they like the current system. They're not going to stop experimenting with it. And basically, what Ian's point was essentially was trying to strike a balance between having items you chase, essentially items you have to work at to get, and not sort of having that carrot linger out there for too long. And then not sort of pulling it back too, so it's too predictable where it's like, I will do this content for 3 weeks and then I will have all my items and everything will be great, right? I think they don't want to be too deterministic, we'll say, in their looting, but at the same time, they don't want you to have to, you know, create a bunch of alts, boost them, and do LFR Sarkareth to get the augmentation legendary, right? Like, I think they need to strike that
Yeah.
balance.
Yep.
I will say the current like at least gearing wise, I think I'm fine with it. I mean, the catalyst I think is always going to be, people are always going to want that earlier than it comes out. But I think at the 6 week mark, probably the best type of balance where like, at least for me, like that's the point in any sort of new raid patch where I'm like, okay, time to start playing an alt, and I really don't want to have to worry about collecting tier,
Yeah.
right? Like my main will have already had 4-piece, so I think there's a balance. I think we can argue about if 6 weeks makes sense to. I think people on both sides of that argument are probably valid. But I will say is that I hope the upgrade system continues. It's just slowed down, meaning like I don't want 10 aspect crests to be able to be gotten the first week. I think in my mind, if you move that back to like 3 or 4, I think that's probably a better number in terms of the overall upgrades.
I mean, I think 10 in week 1 is fine because you look at like the worm crests that you actually needed to upgrade Mythic Plus gear. You got 10 in the first week, and that was enough to upgrade 3 items.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe upgrading 3 items to 441 week 1 is too much. You know, okay, maybe so. Um, the real kind of, I still maintain that the real breaking point was that you could take your 10 aspect crests and turn them into 10 more worm crests. And so instead of
Yeah.
doing 3 on week 1, you could do 5, and you could do another 5 the next week, and then you were done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, and that's yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think in general though, they probably just need to slow it down. So, however they build that balance in terms of like, is it less worms, is it less aspects, or less of both? I just think it was way too fast this tier, which is the first time they put it in, which is
Yeah,
understandable.
yeah,
Like I was talking to some friends last night, and like my point, at least for me personally, like if you hit that 4 week timeline of like you need 4 weeks of like maxing out your collection of crests to upgrade all your gear, I think that is a happy spot to try and hit. Right. Where like you've got your 2 crafted pieces, if they continue that, you've gotten all your actual like heroic or mythic gear. Well, maybe not mythic gear, but your heroic
your
gear
heroic
upgraded to
gear, yeah.
max. Yeah, and then like you're slowly working on upgrading your mythic gear, which I guess at the time mythic wasn't in. So, um, but yeah, that's I think in general they seem happy with it. They just want to like always. They don't want. It seems like they don't want to go maybe more the Final Fantasy model of like deterministic killing a certain set of bosses or a certain like piece of content this
Right.
many times nets you this specific upgrade.
Right, the kind
Right?
of
They want to
thing
stay away from that.
where, the final boss of a wing of their tiers will always drop 2 weapon tokens, and so it
Yep.
is going to take you a maximum of 4 weeks to get one of those weapon tokens if you are raiding with the same 8 people every week.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Um, so I was just on that. They talked a little bit about the leveling experience. Really, no big news other than BFA is going, or sorry, Dragonflight will replace BFA as sort of the default leveling experience as a part of their plan in the future, which is good. I think Dragonflight's better than BFA.
Mm-hmm.
Get me the hell out of the mall. Or not the mall. BFA was actually BFA is not that bad, but I
BFA
don't like the
leveling was
pyramid.
fine.
If
It
you're the
just
horde though, the pyramid and like that zone is terrible actually.
I don't totally agree with that, but the story of BFA leads into the story of Shadowlands, which is a big black mark on BFA by proxy.
That's fair. That's fair. So yeah, so they're upgrading that shortly, and they're also looking at heirlooms, which I think is really interesting because I don't know if you. So I don't like typically if I'm gonna level something, I just boost it. But I did go back and so I started a character probably like 3 or 4 months ago. It was a couple months ago, and I didn't have heirlooms for it, and I then tried to like
Get
take
heirlooms?
heirlooms and then upgrade them. It is a massive amount of gold. Like I
Yeah.
didn't realize that like just to upgrade one heirloom is like 50,000 gold or something
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then you have to kit out a thing if you don't have that armor
Which
spec.
you could,
So
I don't know if you still can. You could spend alternate currencies. Like at one point, you could spend Valor on it. You could spend
oh
PvP
yeah,
currencies. So you could spend other currencies on
that's
it.
the BFA or that's the Shadowlands vendor, right? In Orbos, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe they're still around.
So there are other things you could spend on those upgrades, but yeah, they are not cheap. I am a no heirloom gamer, so I just don't use them. I don't engage
Fair
with that
enough.
system pretty much at all.
I so it's funny. The only reason I cared was like back in what was it? What was the back in was it MOP? No, back in WAD. Garrosh dropped a heirloom
The
trinket.
heirloom, yeah,
Or heirloom,
heirloom
not trinket, but
weapons,
like
weapons.
item, yeah, weapons, yeah, or shields and stuff like that. So I cared about it then because I was like, limited, limited time drops. I
Yeah,
need
yeah.
these.
I had
But yeah,
a
no.
I had a friend that at that point I wasn't rating, like I hadn't started
Mhm.
rating yet. I had a friend that was like, "Oh, like we are doing sales of garage, and we just don't have another buyer for this. It's like get your garage kill." So I have a garage kill that dropped the weapon. So my hunter has the heirloom bow.
Oh, nice, nice. Yeah. So it looks like they're looking at the leveling experience. I know that we've talked at length that like they probably need to do something, but I think retail maybe is a little too far gone to to
I
bring
wouldn't.
back the fun of leveling.
I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. They didn't really talk about the actual problems with leveling in
Yeah, like
this interview, so
yeah. And then the only other thing that I wanted to bring up, unless you, well, before we talk about evokers, and you can always add some other stuff, is they did talk a little bit about the fact that Zaralek Caverns, like the way you interact with content in Zaralek, differs as the content stays, the longer the content is out. So like week 1 and week 2, a bunch of people in there doing their leveling, or not leveling, but doing their like rep stuff, or
yeah.
killing rares and stuff like that. And so it's very, very packed versus now it's essentially empty, right? And so like there needs to be a balance in the way that they either like they talked mostly about rares and things like that, but the idea of like balancing rares, so like first week they may have more health because there's more people and you need more time to get there. As the
Yeah.
content goes on, lowering the health so you can solo or like 2-man
And that's like
the rares.
they have stuff right now. One of the issues they run into is gear scaling as well. I think they have had the system since BFA where rares scale their HP based on the number of people in combat with them. But
Mm-hmm.
when you have, for example, a couple of highly geared raiders that happen to be the first ones on the mob, it can actually still die before other people get to it. It's not just like the number of players that are on it. So
Yeah.
they maybe need something where the HP actually just scales on the number of people in the zone to some degree.
Yeah.
That way people actually
Sure.
have time to like, oh, the skull or whatever the icon is popped up on my map. I want to go over there, and they just cannot get there in time because some very well geared, very high DPS people were there first and just like beat the crap out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we'll see what they said they're going to keep this in mind for like future content, which I mean, always good to take feedback and stuff like that. So, we'll see what happens, but yeah, it's definitely. I was doing some Zaralek stuff the other day, and it was ghost town. Like rares were sitting up forever. So,
Yeah.
um,
One thing I did want to briefly bring up: if you are a user of the default action bars, 10.15 brought a probably surprising change, where they are now very flashy and loud.
oh, I didn't know. Okay.
Um, they like when you cast a spell, all of your spells that have cast times show a cast bar on them. When you cancel a spell, this is the canceling a spell. I think is actually a useful effect. It shows like a red circle on the spell that you canceled.
Mhm.
When your GCD ends, everything gets a little bit of a sparkly effect briefly. There's a bunch of other little effects like that, and it's just there's no way to configure them, even if you get into like the advanced interface option. There's no way to configure it. It's all on and there's no way to turn it off, really. So they did confirm that there is a hotfix in the works to roll a lot of that back, um, probably pending actual settings for it to be able to like turn off parts or all of it. Um,
Mhm.
Even if they just add like CVARs, the advanced interface options can let people configure it in detail, and
Yeah.
the actual main menu can just be like on or off or whatever, on or minimal or off, because it is very
Yeah.
distracting.
I did not know that. I don't play with the default bars, but yeah, I can imagine if you're not expecting it, a little flashy.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, cool. Well, I guess now we can move on to the evoker, and really it's augmentation. So there was a section of questions around augmentation evoker, and they sort of split it up between how the class is playing and then how it's interacting from like a community perspective point of view, I guess you could say. Um, and so basically, they said sort of out of the gate, based on the data they have, particularly around Mythic Plus, happy with how it's going. Seems like a good class to bring. They do need more raid data, which they might have gotten a little bit more today.
lucky.
But but they seem to be at least happy with how it is. And their goal, they sort of mentioned, is to basically balance augmentation around other DPS. So they don't want augmentation to fall behind or be lower, just overall DPS. They want it to sort of fit in with its contributions with where other DPS classes are, which is really good. Um, they also talked a little bit about the theory crafting around augmentation, which if you don't know anything about augmentation, we don't we're typically a monk podcast we can talk about here.
Right.
Theory crafting is hilarious because it's essentially how well, not even how, like no monk class, I think no monk spec, at least since I've been, ear to the ground in the TC community has been like this. But essentially for augmentation evokers, it's like you want intellect, you want mastery, and you want nothing else. Like there are basically like if a ring has like if you have a ring that's like 20 item level difference and the lower one has mastery, you wear that ring,
Right.
right? Like because every other secondary stat is so bad for augmentation because it does not buff essentially ebb and might, which is what you give to other players to buff their damage or to
Right.
increase their main stat, right? So your only goal is augmentation, buffing ebb and might. Mastery does that, and then your own intellect does that too. So
Right.
in general, those are the only two stats you care about,
Yeah.
and everything else is god awful, like to the point of like, yeah, you actively avoid equipping things that don't have mastery on them.
Yeah.
So they talked about this, which is actually really interesting to me that they actually mentioned this or sort of commented on that fact. And it's like I think they kind of took a little bit of a cop out. They sort of made the point of like, well, we think it's like easier to gear as like a new spec, and from a support perspective, it makes gearing a little bit easier. And I think there's probably some merit to that. It's the first support spec in the game, so like
Right.
giving it some sort of complexity, particularly around stats or even rotation, which we haven't talked about, but rotation is extremely simple. Um, just makes it so like entering in or actually playing the class becomes more difficult, right? So nowadays it's like, or now in its current iteration, generally a very easy spec to play, and also generally a very easy spec to gear for,
Yeah.
which I think lends itself to more people trying it out. So
Yeah. It in some ways is actually kind of similar to classic gearing. Not like the really absurd high end classic gearing where you're like getting random old world items and stuff like that, but a lot of people's experience of classic gearing way back then is like you had a stat that you cared about. Maybe you cared about armor penetration and you just hard stacked
yep.
armor penetration. And that was your experience of gearing, even if it wasn't like technically 100% optimal, but that was your experience of it. It was very straightforward. Armor penetration, good. Not armor penetration, not good. Very straightforward.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment a little bit on the like, you know, they talked about people focusing a lot on the DPS and talking about the utility that Augmentation Evoker brings. Because of how much utility Augmentation brings, they've kind of put themselves in a very difficult spot. Because it can't be as good in terms of damage as other specs. And also
Oh yeah.
bring all of the utility that it does. And even things like, they brought up the fact that Tank's mitigation scales off of main stat, and Eben Might buffs your main stat by quite a bit. It actually is a very noticeable impact in keys. Like I've done a couple of like 22, 23 kind of territory keys with an Augmentation Evoker, and it was very noticeable how safe it felt. And then there's other things like they bring shields, which were bugged, and that got hotfixed this week. They have a shield that's supposed to be capped based on their max HP, and it was not capped, so it was very large shields. But then also it's just like they bring a lot of stuff to a key. They bring things like they bring a spell that you can put on somebody that lets them cast while moving.
It's a heal. Well, it's healer only. So yeah.
Well, I mean, sure. The only people that have really long channels that you can't like move during are healers.
Yeah,
So
our healers. Yeah, that's
yeah.
very good.
So like
It's a,
letting your holy priest cast during like cast him and walk away from a mechanic
is massive. Yeah. I mean that like speaking of like even main I mean main set for healers is huge too.
Yeah.
So like in I think the right now the like in raid Eben Might will more than likely never hit a healer unless you're gaming it to hit them.
Yeah.
But in keys like augmentation, like to what you said, like there's a bunch of anecdotal like tweets and like some other community stuff that's like I did a 23 with an augmentation evoker, felt like a 20, right? Or felt like a 21. Like where like them being in the group is like noticeably making the entire key better more than just what they individually bring. So it's a really cool thing.
Yeah.
But
I think basically my point is they kind of overloaded the utility of the augmentation, including like the main stat buffs. Being so good for things that aren't just DPS, to the point that like augmentation really cannot be as good at DPS as other specs, or there's very little reason to bring other specs except to be the things that are buffed by the Augmentation Evoker. Speaking of which, you want to talk about the Unholy DK log?
Well, one quick thing. So I do have some. So while at the higher level keys, augmentation very good.
Right,
People notice it. in the mid tier, which is where, so my little baby evoker, augmentation evoker, doing my 14s or 15s, right? Just kind of chilling. Um, Not as nice, we'll say. I
Have people been
definitely,
kicking you?
I haven't gotten kicked yet, but I did get into an argument with a mage in a halls about why I was only doing 30,000 damage. Like, why was I doing less than the healer? Or 30 or 40. I was like, me and the healer were competing, and they were like,
Yeah.
this evoker's terrible. Like, and I'm just like, I feel like we need to like, yeah. So we've gotten in a slight argument. I was nice about it, sort of. And so yeah, so that was, I have felt that there was that key, and there's actually one other key where someone mentioned something. But then somebody else in the group was like, he's augmentation or their augmentation, like their damage is generally gonna look lower. So I think that's gonna be maybe the one stigma. Although honestly, with this log that's coming out, and plus a lot of the other community perception at the high end that are very high
Some of it'll
on augmentation,
bleed
I think it's
downwards.
less, yeah,
Yeah.
than what we'll see. But yeah, it's, I guess the one limitation, so people are aware of, is that there are in logs combat hooks. I think we talked about this last week, where
Yeah.
logs can show the contribution of the augmentation evoker, which means for a site like Warcraft logs, you should log your Mythic Plus runs, which is something that people traditionally haven't done. But let's push more traffic to your employer, emallson. Great, um, but it doesn't show in game. So the in game combat log doesn't have the same attribution, which means like details, recount, like those sort of damage meters only show the actual damage the evoker has done and not the contribution of ebb and might to DPS classes. So they look low, but use Warcraft logs, or I think it's really the only log site out there.
Yeah.
Use that to
It is.
see to see the
Um,
contribution. So,
so
but yeah,
this is, I didn't actually watch this part of this interview. They didn't really like the way the summary of it is written is like, right now the spec is super new, so the support's just not there yet. You literally, it was a deliberate decision by Blizzard to not put the combat log hooks in game. So
yeah,
that's realistically never coming to details until they actually change their mind on that. Details has like a work in progress augmentation reattribution thing that, as far as I know, is even farther off than the Warcraft logs one. The Warcraft logs one is also off, but that's because Blizzard bugs. There's no pet reattribution, so unholy DKs look really good. BM hunters look really good. Uh, Certain damage accumulation effects don't get reattributed, so stuff like ignite. So mages look really good, and totem for arcane mages, same deal. There's some other it's like execution sentence. I don't know if that still exists, but that was one. There's just a bunch of like those floating around that don't get reattributed. And then in the other direction, the combat log takes too much damage from physical damage events because they forgot to factor in armor reducing the amount of damage that's done.
that's awesome.
Then there's also a bug where if a damage event is fully absorbed, they like screw up the calculation, and it can subtract millions of damage from someone for a
That is
hit that was fully
hilarious.
absorbed. So we've gotten a few bug reports because this happens on Assault of the Zhakali. The caster ads that do their channel with the shield. Well, your damage, if it's fully absorbed and you have Ebb and Might, it can freak out and take away like millions of damage. We had somebody pop up and they, because we
Jesus,
didn't really have a, like, the code is not set up to handle somebody doing negative DPS.
that's fair. Yeah,
Their estimated rank was negative 247. It
that is
just
hilarious.
completely broke it.
It's random. Yeah.
So yeah, logs are kind of scuffed right now too in general, but as long as you're aware of what the limitations are, right? Like you can look at the augmentation evoker and go, okay, they were buffing, a DK and a Beastmaster Hunter. They're gonna look worse than one that was buffing, a Frost Mage.
Yeah, exactly. I think the other thing too that's missing is none of the healing events,
Oh
at
yeah,
least in keys, contain the hook. So like your
yeah.
heal, like there's not
Healing
a,
events are double fucked.
yeah, like you can't. There's no contribution of the augmentation evoker to healing in a key. I mean, maybe in a raid you'd care, but like that would be sort of a specific thing based on Ebon Might's targeting. So,
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah. It's really difficult. You have to basically put prescience on a healer to make Ebon Might target them in a raid, unless you have like tons and tons of augmentation evokers.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it mostly doesn't come up, but it technically does. And you could use it to just like get really good healing parses. On top of like if you also had echoing Tyrstone, you would basically be unbeatable.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, so cool, yeah. So I guess real quick, or not real quick, but to the extent that augmentation is potentially broken, I think a couple streamers or content creators put together a raid, which essentially had, I think, like 20. What is this? Like 22 augmentation evokers.
Yeah, something like that. It's a
Um,
30-person
so
raid, and yeah,
yeah,
22.
yeah. And then two unholy DKs that they were buffing, and they were killing heroic bosses in sub 30 to 40 seconds, which is up to like up through Magmarax. I think, every kill was extreme. Like Rashok was a 20-second kill. Uh Magmarax was 17 seconds.
The only
Echo was 3
reason
minutes.
anything is longer than this is just because of RP on these fights and intermissions and things. Like Echo of Neltharion is a 3-minute long kill because they push the boss in phase 1 to the end of his phase 2, like where it caps the HP at 35%,
And
and
have to
then
kill
have
the
to
ads.
waddle around slowly killing. It takes forever to kill the ads with 22
Yeah.
augmentation evokers. Um, so yeah, then like similar deal with Sarkareth, the boss like hard stopped them at 30% in phase 1, and
Hmm.
then entirely skipped phase 2 and went into phase 3.
Yeah.
Um, and
Which is
so
amazing.
it's it's a little busted. It's a little busted. These numbers look like the all Windwalker raid that we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Where the all Windwalker raid, kind of abusing the tier set thing, where it was multiplying every Windwalker's damage for every application of the tier set from any Windwalker. So if you got 30 in the same raid, it was just really insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the I wish I could actually pull this up. I managed to break my stream setup, so I can't pull it up
Gotcha.
on stream. I tried, and so
Nice.
basically, my understanding of how this is working is a couple of things. First off, you have specs that have really really high bursts. So you have two unholy DKs in here and an arcane mage. These are
Hmm.
your base that like augmentation evokers basically multiply other specs damage, and so you
Yep.
want to get the biggest bursty specs out there for your base for everybody to multiply. They have two shadow priests in here too that are basically, I'm pretty sure, just there to PI the unholy
Yep.
DKs, which is hilarious.
So good.
And then the arcane mage also brings bloodlust, which is nice. Because did you know none of the tanks have bloodlust?
Oh, interesting. Did
Um,
not.
yeah.
Makes sense.
So then the next step of this is evokers have an ability called Breath of Aeons. Breath of Aeons puts a debuff. It's like their like deep breath or dream breath equivalent, and it puts a debuff on everything it hits that is going to accumulate all of the damage that gets put into it by targets with Ebb and Might.
And
And
then
then what you do is Breath of Aeons also scales off. If you get Ebb and Might off on other people that are augmentation evokers that have also used Breath of Aeons,
just, yeah.
to the moon.
Just, yeah, exponential
Um,
scaling basically, which is
yeah.
crazy.
So
Yeah, I mean,
that's kind of how this works.
yeah, I mean, this is definitely, I think, a very niche case of like stacking it to the extreme. In terms of like, yeah, 22 or so augmentation evokers in a single raid. I don't know how much this trickles into actual progression content.
Yeah.
Where Blizzard needs to make a change here, but it is interesting that you can push the game to this level with this sort of new support spec and some of the new interactions with abilities. So
I
we'll
suspect that they're going to do something about the Breath of Aeon scaling. Um,
yeah.
like for reference, Mythic Sarkareth has 666 million HP. Heroic 30-player Sarkareth has 600 million HP. Now, you can't get the exponentials as large with 20 people instead of 30. That is a very important detail.
Hmm.
But you can still make them very big. Um, and they're already kind of limited by the Ebb and Might thing. Like, you can't scale off of somebody's Breath of Aeons that didn't have your Ebb and Might on them. You can only Ebb and Might 3 targets, or 5 targets, rather. Or
Yep.
4. It's like 4. So you're already kind of limited by that. Um, But even with all those limitations and everything, like if you were to put together a comp very similar to this and walk into Mythic Sarkareth, I suspect you would be able to just like hard push out of phase 1.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think healing still becomes an issue, so I don't know if you get, as many. Like, you'd still need 2 or so healers, but
Well, it
be
depends on how
interesting.
much of the phase you skip.
That's true. That's true.
I guess you need like you have to clear all of your debuffs, so you would probably still need healer. Like you would still need healers. It's just a question of
Yeah.
like how many healers. You'd have AMZs, you'd have evokers bringing lots of absorbs. Very
Yeah.
durable class, bringing lots of absorbs. And yeah, like
Might just be okay.
so potentially you would run into actual issues where you have to clear 2 debuffs on Mythic as opposed to just the one on Heroic. So you would, depending on how fast you pushed, would need to do some shenanigans to make it work.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very, very good.
Yeah, it's a very good I mean, like I said, I've been having a blast playing it. I feel really strong. And yeah, like I said, it's not too complex. So if you're looking to get into the support thing, I think it's a really cool like first iteration. But Blizzard definitely will have to start to think about if they expand a support class beyond just evokers and add a second one, they'll definitely need to take into account how both support classes interact with each other. Because right now there's definitely a scaling issue with just one. You add a second type of scaling into the mix, and I think it becomes a lot more complex there. So
one thing I don't know how this works. I was asking a couple people about it and I didn't get a clear answer. I don't know if people really know because it's pretty niche, I would say. But Ebon Might says this: increase your nearest 4 allies' primary stat by 10% of your own. So if you are buffed by Ebon Might as an augmentation evoker, does your Ebon Might then provide more stats too?
yeah, I don't know. But in the past, when they've implemented certain stuff, like, well, typically there's a trigger, right? It's either your base stats or,
I'm just thinking.
well,
Like,
it could go any way, right? Because it could be your
yeah.
base stats, like from gear only.
Yep.
It could be any buffs on top of that.
And it could just
Plus,
ignore Ebon Might. Like they have done stuff like that before. Like,
yeah.
I don't know exactly how this works, but one possibility is that you could kind of do this thing that other MMOs, we called it laddering, where you would buff a stat that would let you unlock another buff that you would use to buff the thing that originally let you cast the stat buff, and you would just alternate
Ping back
and
and forth.
just like get crazy stat values. Anyway, I'm curious if you could do that with Ebon Might now.
Yeah.
I have not looked very much into the Augmentation Evoker community, but I'm sure they're already on the case, especially in light of this morning's shenanigans.
Yeah, trying to figure it out. So, well, cool. Well, only a couple more topics. I know we're going a little bit long today, but we did have a ton of stuff I think to cover. So, and we do have a question this week, which I actually want to talk about because I think it's important. So real quick, they did release the first set of 10.1.7 notes. We're not going to go through them, but except for one point, which is very monk specific. So under the Mistweaver heading for 10.1.7, they did make a developer's note. Now there's no spell changes to this, but the note essentially reads that they are looking into making changes to mana tea coming into 10.1.7. Essentially, and this is sort of an interesting set of words they put together, is their goal for this redesign, and I'll just read it word for word, is to centralize Mistweaver's mana management into a dynamic, evergreen talent that offers a satisfying way to actively engage with mana as a resource and addresses some of the long-standing mana concerns in a more permanent way. Which essentially reads that we're getting old mana tea back, which maybe.
Okay,
so like if you're
I'm
not
gonna
familiar,
need you to explain that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with the way, so when Mistweaver first came out, I think a couple things were different than the way the class was today. Number one, we had chi as a resource, and a lot of our like building and spending was centered around or balanced around chi, which meant mana was essentially a secondary resource for much of what we did. Mana helped you maintain certain buffs like renewing mist out on the raid, and then you used chi to actually do the bulk of your healing. As a part of this, so that was one piece of it, which meant our mana costs were generally higher because we were able to leverage chi to push more healing.
Okay.
as a part of this, Mana Tea was a spell that wasn't like it was today. It was essentially was based on a buff you got, and then you consume that buff to give yourself mana back. So as you did certain actions, it was actually just based on random ticks of renewing mist. I don't remember the specific implementation. You could then channel Mana Tea and consume those stacks and get mana back. So the idea is if you got up to, I think it's capped at 20 stacks, you could eat those 20 stacks for mana, and you essentially could refill your mana bar. It played kind of like Arcane Mage in many cases, where
Right.
you could basically use all your mana of evoke, or not? Was that yeah? That's
Evocation.
Evoke. Oh, evocate, and then get all your mana back. So similar Mana Tea was set up that way. It was sort of a dynamic way of doing it. The stacks were not generally controlled by you; they sort of randomly occurred. But you did control when you started to consume them. It was through a channel. There eventually was a glyph that allowed you, that put Mana Tea on a cooldown, but you would instantly consume stacks. So you didn't have to channel. You could just sort of slam it and consume stacks. But it was definitely a dynamic way of interacting with your mana. So we'll see if that actually occurs. It's much different than today's Mana Tea, which is just a 10-second buff that halves the mana cost of all your spells. So it's less interactive. So we'll see. I mean, the thing is, I'm all for it. I'm all for like more ways to interact with your mana. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Onion, for reminding me. It's by spending chi and having multi-strike got you more charges of the Mana Tea buff, which you then could consume for mana. So it was a much more dynamic game. I would say in today's Mistweaver, there's already a lot of dynamicness to it. Like the fact of tracking rem stacks, of pushing those sort of like ramp windows, and then adding this on top of it from a mana management perspective might be a little too much. But I'm for one excited. I mean, to be fair, always excited for changes to the class. So changing Mana Tea potentially back to original Mana Tea, which I think is maybe a pipe dream. They probably do something a little bit different. Will be interesting.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, Mistweaver has had mana issues the entire time. Just the entire time it's existed, basically, since Legion. And the only time I think that it hasn't really had mana issues are periods where the spec was so broken that you just kind of ignored it as a resource.
Yeah. Like right now, like I would say right now is one of those times where like you essentially can play no mana talents, just have 2-piece and be generally fine in almost any mythic content, right? Yeah. Like you play around Yulan, things like that. You're perfectly fine. So yeah, I mean, since Legion, with the removal of chi, they've never really nailed Mistweaver's mana, like we'll say targets or like mana usage on spells, right? They've either been wildly off or like not enough, or like the spells we want to use are just low mana cost anyway, and they're the most powerful. So yeah, it's been an interesting, we'll say, balancing period since the Legion rework for them. So yeah, this sort of points us or pushes us maybe in a more interesting direction. So
if it means that Mistweavers stop being like mana about everything, because it is actually a problem, right? And it is a real limiter. You know, that'll be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I hesitate. So I might be maybe a little bit different than community. I think our mana cost is high, but I think you can play around it. So I'm not in that full camp of like we have mana issues. I think you can play around them.
I mean, I think it kind of like
you have the community perception is you're a high mana cost class, and like I think the biggest problem, maybe my issue with that perception, is it's stemmed from the fact that like we waste a lot of mana catching up from mistakes. So if you don't play or plan ahead, you spend a lot of mana to then catch up, and so and generally like you don't have a waste. Yeah, you fall further behind. You don't have very good ways to recover mana, which I think is maybe what they're looking at. Like where if a mistake happens in your own play, you're essentially behind for the remainder of that fight. Versus other classes have ways to either catch back up or have some sort of equilibrium.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I mean, this talent can go like everybody when this first came out was like, oh, Mana Tea's coming back, but to be fair, they could go a different direction, focus more on like short reductions, almost like Thunder Focus Tea, and like you reduce certain spells with certain intervals, or you build up a reduction where then you can use it on a set of spells that comes up. I mean, it's they could go honestly anyway with it, but yeah, we'll see. We'll see, but it's interesting. More change, more. I mean, not massive, but like we'll say solid changes in Mistweaver coming up, and just class in general, which I think is awesome in 10.7. So.
Real quick thing from our previous topic. Someone in chat, Abo Sumer, is saying that Ebonite stacking on augmentation is ignored, or at least was on PTR, and they're not sure if it's been rechecked on live. But at least at some point, the developers saw of that, said we don't want people to ladder Ebonite up to a bajillion main stat,
Yeah.
and cut it off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll I mean, yeah, it's good that they sort of cut that off. But yeah, on the Mistweaver talent thing, we'll see where they take Manatee. It'll be interesting. I think they probably I mean, based on the current play style and how good two piece is, they definitely have to make a change going into next year.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what they do in 10.1.7. Well, cool. Well, final thing, and I know we're about 10 minutes over our current time, but just bear with us here. We did get a question this week, which I think is interesting. And I guess we'll read it. So it comes from Matthias. And they ask, with the release of the Augmentation Evoker and a lot of the newer smart targeting built into many of their abilities, primarily Ebonite, are we going to see similar quality of life improvements for other classes? Healers in particular have withdrawn their focus out of the game world when staring at health bars that need to be clicked on. So smart targeting.
My
As a
comment,
healer, sorry,
yeah, my comment on this is that we already have this. We had,
we did.
yeah.
So if people aren't familiar, I mean, we'll say WAD
It's
is
been
really
a long time.
yeah. I think WAD was the peak of this, maybe Kata, and then they've basically scaled everything back since then. But previous iterations of healers, spells were essentially smart. Most healer spells that hit a group were smart heal spells, meaning they would target your lowest HP raid members with it. So like Wild Growth for druids, I think is still an example of smart healing. I think that still has smart healing capabilities in place, but every bounce of chain heal used to heal the lowest health target in range of the person it's jumping from. Like Efflorescence would do the same thing in an AoE. What are some other things? Like Renewing Mist, I think used to jump to the lowest HP health target in range. So we've had smart healing in the past. Blizzard has slowly scaled back that, and I don't think smart healing comes back. I like in general, like the idea is they don't want. I think Blizzard doesn't want any sort of non-targeted AoE healing to always be the most effective healing, like to be the most effective healing you can do, which
Yeah,
it's probably an effective heal anyway, but like if it also targeted the lowest health members, it becomes just that much better.
right.
Um,
So Onion is pointing out that like Radiance currently goes on people without atonement. I think that's slightly different because
yeah,
Radiance is not. I mean, Radiance is a heal now. Historically, Radiance was not a heal in
no,
any meaningful sense of the word. It was a thing that applied to atonement, and you can't. So, like, if it would target people at random that already had atonement, you would end up in situations where sometimes you would get a ramp, and your radiances would give you 10 targets, and other times
yeah.
you'd have a ramp, and your radiances would give you 5 targets, and that would be really, really bad.
Yeah, I mean it's like I mean it's similar to the current renewing mist jumping logic, where like renewing mist will not jump to a target that already has renewing mist,
Yeah,
even if they meet the being damaged profile of it. It'll always try and find a target without renewing mist on it
yeah,
when it triggers its jump. So, yeah, I mean when we say, I guess to clarify, when we say smart healing, it's literally generally in the past smart healing is meant targeting the lowest health members of your raid, like the lowest health individual member of your raid with a non-targeted spell,
yeah.
basically.
It's basically
Um,
it's spells that there's two different kinds of smart I think that are going on. One is the renewing mist or atonement kind, where it kind of bricks the spell if there's not that kind of somewhat
yeah.
intelligent thing where you don't put atonement on the same targets, or you don't have your renewing mist jump to a target that already has renewing mist and just kind of delete one from existence, right?
Yep.
And then there's the other kind, which is smart heals that are um, can be good on their own without the intelligence, something like a chain heal.
Yep.
But then you add this extra thing where they try and pick the best targets at all times, according to whatever best there is, and then they just become really oppressive actually from a gameplay perspective.
Yeah,
Uh,
you get you get BC era or sun like BC era shaman, which was literally you put chain heal on a scroll wheel and you just moused over anybody you wanted and you topped healing meters because
yeah,
it didn't matter because your chain heal was always going to hit the most effective targets.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, so I mean, I would say smart healing targeting probably not coming back in terms of like augmentation. I think this goes back to what we talked about when we first sort of brought it up in this episode, which was I think Blizzard wanted to make augmentation as easy as possible to jump in and start playing.
Yeah.
And the fact that Ebon Might has essentially targets probably the best members, right?
Yeah.
Or like has some logic built in that you can sort of game, but in general, always target a member that will be able to use the buff of your group or raid. Makes sense for this initial iteration of the
Yeah.
class.
I also just think there's a bit of a difference here where like targeting people that are low health is a thing that makes sense and is pretty clear from just the standard default UI. You don't need any super fancy tracking to tell. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Ebon Might is very different from that in that if we didn't have something that like what it does right now, the way it works right now, it will always put 2 of your 4 Ebon Might buffs on your targets with prescience. So prescience is like this. You could think of it like beacon of light that you put out
Yeah.
on 2 targets, and they always get your Ebon Might. Um, and then there is some intelligence for the other 2, where like if a mage is in combustion or in icy veins or something like that, they are going to have preference to get a buff over somebody that's not in cooldown. And you can think of like, okay, what would it require you to set up as a player in order to make that decision yourself, right? You would need to be you would need to know everybody's cooldowns, add them to your UI to show them, and then you can imagine like if it were a renewing mist kind of thing, instead of you push everybody and it goes to 4 targets, it would be like having to keep track of like, oh, their combustion's almost up, let me like make sure that I don't give it to somebody else, I need to hang on to it
Yeah.
for them, as opposed to how it works right now, where it kind of does this reasonably intelligent thing of like trying to go on people with cooldowns. Although that one has issues as well, because Bestial Wrath for BM hunters is one of the cooldowns and it's like 80% uptime.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's the current smart targeting for Ebon Might is better than complete random by a lot, but it still has its own issues that come with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say, I mean, like the second half of the question, the comment about healers sort of taking their eyes out of the game and into their raid frames only, that's definitely an issue, but I don't think smart healing solves that, right? Because essentially then, like, you turn into what Mistweaver kind of was in the end of Shadowlands, which
Where
is
you turn your raid frames off.
you just turn your raid frames off, hit Essence Font. Just make sure you have Essence Font ready for whenever you hit the what's the mirror ability from
Yeah,
Venthyr? God, I forgot
the
of it.
Venthyr ability. I don't remember what it's
Whatever,
called.
I
The
cannot
Backstreet
remember what
Boys.
for the life.
Whenever you summon the
Yeah,
Backstreet Boys.
yeah. Then like, and then you hit Essence Font after that, and then you're good. Fallen Order, thanks, Onion. That's the other extreme of then you are in the game world, but like the buttons you press don't matter. And I think Blizzard will always want you as a healer to, use abilities on certain targets and make that's a part of the decision making of being a healer. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
I doubt we see that smart targeting go into healing at all. Maybe it goes into other, DPS abilities or other,
Yeah.
definitely other support abilities, but
And
yeah.
so kind of where Ebon Might falls is there's a little bit of like intelligence in the what would be the randomly targeted Ebon Might, but there's still the ability for the evoker to move their prescience around and be like, okay,
Yeah.
this person is going to be going into cooldowns, or maybe this person's doing a setup for a cooldown, like you have like a demo lock that's doing a setup for or something. And so you can move your prescience over to them and actually exercise that control and bypass the smart healing is maybe not going to do the right thing, but then you can use prescience to override it and make your own decisions.
Yeah.
And the fact that you would want to do that kind of says to me that the smart healing or smart targeting of Ebon Might is not fundamentally oppressive. Like, it's not to the point that the healer can't reasonably do better. It's a
Yeah.
little bit more of like a happens on the kind of planning side of things instead of on the reactive side of things. Like, you're not reacting to people's cooldowns so much with it. You're kind of knowing
Exactly.
like, okay, at 3 minutes they're gonna nether portal and I'm gonna give them prescience so that they guaranteed get the Ebon Might.
At this point, yeah.
Right. Versus like part of the issue with smart healing is that you would end up with situations where the smart heal, because it's the computer making the decision, it can deal with all the information being presented just much faster than the person
Right.
can. And so the player kind of had their agency overreacting, eliminated by smart heals being too good. So
Yeah.
it removed the reactive thing where now instead of reacting to the damage and trying to pick the best target and being a good healer because you could quickly process information and make correct decisions about targeting priority and healing priority,
Mhm.
you just kind of like picked somebody that didn't have a full health bar and let the smart heal react to the information instead,
Or just always heal the tank, and then
or just
any
always
of
heal
your
the tank.
bounces on chain heal. The initial heal would at least heal something, and then
Yeah,
the bounces would target the best player. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, yeah. So I doubt. I mean, again, yeah. I think we nailed this one in that. I think it's good from a support spell perspective that the smart
yeah,
targeting's there. I think it's bad for healing in general. It doesn't let you. It lessens, say, like skill expression, if
yeah.
that's a
I
term we
agree
can
with that.
use.
I agree with that.
Um, for healers. So but yeah, that was. Whew, I think that's everything. We did cut a couple things. We'll have some stuff to talk about next week.
Yeah,
We didn't even
like
talk about the new
pings.
dungeon. Pings. We
Oh
didn't talk about the new
yeah,
dungeon at
yeah.
all.
We talked about
And
loot from the dungeon, but we didn't talk about the
yeah,
dungeon.
exactly,
Dungeon's
exactly.
good, by the way, except for Morky. Morky's kind of ass, but the rest of the dungeon's good. That's my
Nice.
my like 5 second summary.
And
But
hopefully, yeah, we'll maybe get into it next week for sure. So
yeah, I think that is going to be the end of the episode for today. Thank you all for watching and or listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, and you want to support this podcast and the other work that we do over at the Peak of Serenity, you can do that over at our Patreon at patreon.com/Peak of Serenity. And of course, come and join the Discord. It is the best place to wildly speculate about what the new Manatee is going to look like.
exactly, yeah, people got some ideas, some very bad ones, mostly from Onion, but yeah, generally bad ideas.
Or if you want to keep up with the new state of Brewmaster stuff, APL is being actively worked on, rotations being refined. We've had gains since even when I killed Sarkareth on Friday that have been found for the rotation. So a lot of stuff happening there too. If you want to be involved in that, you want to keep up with that, Discord's a great place to do it. But yeah, that is going to be it for the show today. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.
Bye.